There was a time when the land was shrouded in darkness, where every whisper carried the weight of fear, and the heavens seemed to turn away. In the shadows of this world, a creature of immense power and eerie beauty roamed the desolate plains, an entity born not of flesh, but of curse and shadow. It was said to have been forged in the depths of the underworld itself, a horse whose hooves echoed like thunder as it galloped across the earth, a creature with one purpose, to collect the souls of the living and deliver them to the realm beyond. Dear audience, before moving forward, I would like to say, your support means the world to us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and share this video with your friends to keep us motivated as we bring you valuable content. It was not by choice that it did this. No, this cursed horse was bound by a curse older than time, a binding magic that tied it to the will of the underworld. Each night, it would ride through the fog-covered villages and silent towns, its glowing eyes watching from the darkness, its breath chilling the bones of those who dared to look upon it. Whispers of its arrival would send even the bravest hearts into hiding. For the horse was no mere legend, it was a harbinger of doom. But as with all stories of darkness, there lies a twist, a crack in the armor of fate. For this horse, this creature of nightmares, was not without its own struggles. Beneath the surface of its otherworldly eyes, something stirred, a flicker of something more than just a soulless being. As it journeyed from one life to the next, collecting souls without mercy, it began to witness something unfamiliar. The vulnerability of the people it took, the moments they shared, the love they gave. It wasn't supposed to care. It was a being of destruction, a tool of the underworld, a force without remorse. Yet, with every soul it claimed, it felt the weight of their stories, and the harsh reality of what it was doing gnawed at its cursed heart. One fateful night, in the middle of a vast, empty field, it encountered a child, a little girl who should have been beyond its reach. Her family had long since passed, but she had been left behind, alone and afraid. The horse watched as she wandered through the desolate landscape, her innocence untouched by the world's cruelty. She wasn't like the others. She didn't scream or run. She didn't try to hide from the creature that had come for her. Instead, she looked up at it with eyes that, despite the terror of the situation, were filled with a kind of quiet understanding. "Are you here to take me?" she asked softly, her voice trembling in the cold air. The horse felt something stir deep inside, something it had never felt before. A pang, like a long-forgotten memory breaking free. It didn't understand why, but it hesitated. The girl's words echoed in its mind as it loomed over her. In that moment, the line between predator and victim blurred. The cursed horse found itself at a crossroads. Its primal instincts screamed at it to take her, to continue the unrelenting cycle that had been its life for as long as it could remember. But the child's eyes, those innocent, trusting eyes, tugged at something deep within, something it had long forgotten. Compassion. Could it feel such a thing? Could it, this creature of darkness, learn to care? The girl didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply waited, as though she knew something the horse didn't. In that fleeting moment, everything changed. The horse, bound by its curse, knew it had to make a choice. It could take her soul, as it had done countless times before, and follow the path that was carved for it, or it could break free from the chains that bound it and discover a new path, one that led not to death, but to something else, something it had never imagined. As the horse stood there, contemplating its decision, the wind shifted, and a distant howl echoed through the dark sky. It was a warning, a reminder that the underworld was always watching, always waiting. The curse would not let go so easily. The horse could feel the pull of its duty, the weight of its existence pressing down on it, urging it to fulfill its grim task. Yet, the child's face stayed with it, her quiet, steady gaze. It was the first time in its existence that it had been forced to confront something that made it question everything. What was it to be? A soulless creature of the underworld, bound to collect the souls of the living, or something more? The underworld's grip was strong, its magic unyielding, but for the first time, the horse wondered if it could break free. It didn't know what the future held, or if it could ever escape the darkness that defined it. But it knew this: something inside it had changed, and it would never be the same again. As the horse turned away, leaving the girl standing alone in the field, the wind howled once more, this time more insistently. The underworld was not so easily ignored. But as the horse galloped into the night, the question still lingered: could it change? Could it learn compassion? Or was it doomed forever to be a creature of death, with no hope of redemption? And as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the horse disappeared into the distance, its heart heavy with uncertainty. The journey had only just begun. Curse it bore was far from broken, but now, for the first time in its existence, it wondered if there might be something else to life, something worth fighting for. But the underworld was not far behind, and it would not let the horse forget its purpose. The horse stood at the edge of the village, its hooves digging into the earth, the air thick with uncertainty. It had never been this close to the warmth of human life before, never ventured so far from the darkness that had shaped its existence. The lanterns in the windows flickered softly, casting a glow that seemed to reach out toward it, beckoning, but the creature felt as though it were standing at the edge of an abyss. One wrong move, and it could fall back into the cold grip of the underworld. One wrong decision, and it might lose whatever fragile sense of hope it had begun to feel. It was not just the fear of the underworld that held it back. No, it was something deeper, a fear of itself. How could it, a creature born of curses and shadows, dare to walk among the living? What right did it have to try to understand their world, their feelings, when its very existence was defined by taking from them, by dragging their souls into darkness? The horse wanted to understand, to learn, but each step felt like a betrayal, a step further away from its origins. In the distance, a child's laughter echoed through the village streets. The sound was pure, untainted, a reminder of everything the horse had taken and destroyed. It recoiled at the thought, its muscles tensing, its heart heavy with guilt. Every soul it had collected, every life it had extinguished, had it robbed the world of the very joy it heard now? Could it ever make amends? Or was it forever bound to the darkness, its curse too deep to escape? The woman carrying firewood continued to walk, her path taking her toward the heart of the village. She didn't look back, but the horse noticed how her steps were light, almost carefree. How could she be so unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the village, so close to the edge of the world she knew? The horse wanted to warn her, to tell her that darkness had always been at the gates, watching and waiting. But it couldn't speak. It had never spoken, not in the way that humans did. Its voice was the sound of wind howling through empty spaces, of shadows whispering secrets that no one wanted to hear. As the woman disappeared into the village, the horse felt the pull of the darkness once more. The underworld's reach was never far. It could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on its soul, urging it to return, to fulfill its purpose. The curse that bound it was not easily broken. The underworld had eyes everywhere, always watching, always waiting for the moment when the horse would falter and return to its grim task. It had always obeyed before, without question, without hesitation. But now, as it stood in the soft glow of the village, something had changed. The horse turned and moved deeper into the wilderness, away from the village, away from the warmth and the light. The darkness was calling, and it could not ignore it for much longer. It had always been its home. The underworld was where it belonged, where it had always belonged. But now, with each passing moment, it felt something it had never felt before, an almost unbearable yearning to understand the world beyond, to experience it, even if only for a brief moment. And yet the question remained, what was it that it sought? Redemption? Freedom? Or was it simply the desire for something it had never known, a life that was not defined by the taking of souls? It couldn't answer that question, not yet. Path was unclear, and each step forward seemed to lead it into deeper uncertainty. Somewhere in the darkness, a figure stirred. It was the underworld's watcher, a creature that never strayed too far from the horse's path, always waiting for the moment when it would stray too far from its duty. This figure had watched the horse for as long as it could remember, a silent observer in the shadows. The watcher's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, its presence a constant reminder of the underworld's reach. The watcher had never spoken, but it was always there, lurking just beyond the edges of the horse's awareness, its gaze a constant pressure on the creature's mind. The watcher knew that the horse was wavering, and it was not pleased. The horse felt a cold shiver crawl up its spine as the watcher's presence grew stronger. It had felt the watcher's gaze before, but now it seemed different. There was something in the air, a sense of impending judgment. The horse quickened its pace, but no matter how fast it ran, the watcher's eyes followed, never blinking, never turning away. The horse could not escape it, and it knew that the watcher was the embodiment of the underworld's will. It could not defy it forever. But the horse wasn't ready to return. Not yet. It had to know more, to understand what it was fighting for. It could not allow itself to fall back into the cold, empty role it had always played. It needed to make sense of the fragments of emotion that had begun to form within its heart, fragments that were foreign, confusing, and yet undeniably real. Could it learn to care? Could it learn to protect the living instead of claiming them? The watcher's eyes burned into its back, but the horse pushed forward, determined to find the answers it sought. As it traveled deeper into the wilderness, the landscape began to shift once again. The trees were thicker here, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, and the ground grew uneven, as though the earth itself was resisting its presence. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, as if the very world was holding its breath. The horse's steps slowed as it sensed the danger ahead. It wasn't just the watcher anymore. The underworld itself seemed to be closing in, pressing in from all sides. In the distance, a faint light flickered. A campfire, perhaps. The horse hesitated for a moment before moving toward it. It could feel the warmth of the fire, even from this distance, and it was drawn to it. It wasn't just the physical warmth, it was the promise of something more, something it had been denied for so long. The fire could offer a brief respite from the darkness, a moment of peace in a world that had always been filled with shadows. As it approached the fire, the horse saw a figure sitting alone, a man wrapped in a tattered cloak. His face was hidden in the shadows, but there was something familiar about his presence, something that made the horse pause. He had the look of someone who had seen many lifetimes, someone who carried the weight of history in his bones. But there was something else, too, something about his stillness, his calm that seemed to draw the horse in. The horse stepped closer, its hooves making barely a sound on the ground. The man did not turn, did not acknowledge the horse's presence, but the creature could feel his awareness. It was as though the man knew the horse was there, knew what it was, and yet did not fear it. For a moment, there was silence. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, the only comfort in the stillness of the night. The man's voice finally broke the silence, low and gravelly. "You've been wandering for far too long," he said, his words not directed at the horse, but at something deeper. "The underworld is calling. It's never been kind to those who stray." The horse's heart stilled. How did this man know? How could he possibly understand what it had been through? It wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though the man had spoken a truth that the horse already knew, but hadn't been willing to accept. "You think you can escape it," the man continued, his voice soft yet certain. "But the darkness doesn't let go so easily. You can't outrun it. You can't fight it." The horse stood in silence, the weight of the words sinking in. Could it fight? Could it break free from the curse that had shaped its existence? Or was it doomed to remain a creature of shadows, forever bound to the will of the underworld? The fire flickered once more, casting long shadows across the ground. The man did not speak again, but the horse could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken understanding that their paths were somehow connected. There was a choice to be made, but the answer was nowhere to be found, not yet. The horse turned away, the question still burning in its mind. Could it change? Could it learn to care, to protect, to be something more than just a harbinger of death? But the darkness was closing in, and it wasn't ready to face it just yet. The air around the horse seemed to thicken, each breath harder to take as it moved away from the fire. The man's words still echoed in its mind, bouncing off the dark walls of its consciousness. "You can't outrun it. You can't fight it. The underworld, the darkness, the curse." No matter how far it tried to escape, no matter how much it yearned to be something more, it seemed that fate was pulling it back, like invisible chains tightening around its chest. It had hoped for something, some kind of answer, some kind of relief from the weight it carried, but the man had given none. His words had only deepened the uncertainty, and now the horse was left to wrestle with the nagging thought that it might never be free, never find peace. The wilderness stretched out in front of it like a labyrinth of shadows, the trees twisted and reaching, the ground uneven and treacherous. Every step seemed to echo with the reminder that there was no escape, that it was caught between two worlds, neither of which would let it go. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, and the first raindrops began to fall, cold and sharp. The horse quickened its pace, moving deeper into the night, but the rain didn't wash away the doubt or the fear. Instead, it seemed to amplify it, the droplets splattering against the earth like an unrelenting reminder of the world's indifference. And then, just as the horse's heart began to quicken, it felt the presence again, the unmistakable, oppressive weight of the underworld's gaze. It wasn't just the watcher this time. No. This was something worse. The ground beneath its hooves seemed to vibrate with an ancient energy, the earth itself shuddering in response to the pull of the curse. The horse stopped dead in its tracks, its body tense and alert. From the trees, shadows moved, figures materializing out of the mist, their forms indistinct but filled with a cold, menacing energy. There were no words. No sounds, just the heavy, suffocating presence of something coming for it. The air crackled with power, the dark forces gathering around the horse as though they had been waiting, watching, knowing this moment would come. For a long, still moment, there was nothing but the rain, the horse's breath, and the distant thunder. The horse's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to escape this moment. But it knew there was none. It had wandered too far, strayed too long. The underworld had not forgotten. The first of the shadowed figures stepped forward, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its presence was suffocating, the air around it thick with malice. The horse stood frozen, unable to move, as if its very essence was being drawn into the figure's gaze. This wasn't just an observer. This was one of the enforcers, the servants of the underworld, who ensured that no soul strayed too far from its destined path. "You've strayed too far," the enforcer's voice whispered, though its mouth didn't move. The words seemed to reverberate in the very air around them, sending a cold shiver down the horse's spine. "The darkness doesn't forgive those who wander." The horse's heart beat faster, and it stepped back, its muscles tense. It wanted to run, to escape. The shadows were closing in, and the air felt heavier with every passing second. The rain, once a gentle rhythm against the earth, now hammered down like an oncoming storm, the sound deafening in its intensity. More figures appeared, materializing from the darkness, their forms indistinct, swirling in the storm. Each one exuded the same oppressive energy, the same chilling presence. The underworld was closing in on it, and there was no escape. The horse's mind raced. The Watcher, the curse, the darkness. It all rushed back, the weight of the underworld's claim pressing down on it like an anchor. The feeling of the child's gaze, soft and understanding, still lingered somewhere in the horse's thoughts, but it seemed so distant now, so fragile in the face of the looming storm. It had thought it could change. It had thought it could be different, but now, as the shadows closed in, it felt the reality of its existence. It was nothing more than a creature of death, a harbinger of darkness. "Return," the enforcer whispered again, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "Return to your rightful place. Your duty is clear." The horse's heart thudded painfully in its chest, the weight of its curse crushing down on it. It wanted to resist. It wanted to run, to escape, to fight against the darkness that had always defined it. But how could it? What power did it have against the will of the underworld? The figures closed in further, their glowing eyes reflecting the storm's fury, the crackling energy of the underworld thick in the air. The horse could feel the presence of something far older than itself, something vast and unyielding, pushing in from all sides. It was being pulled toward them, pulled toward its purpose, the purpose it had never questioned, the purpose it had always fulfilled. The air crackled with tension as the horse's body tensed, its hooves digging into the earth, its heart pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance. This was it, the final choice, the moment where everything would either shatter or change forever. The enforcer's eyes burned into the horse's, and the words that followed were a warning: you cannot fight fate. But the horse didn't stop. It didn't turn away. Instead, it surged forward, pushing through the storm, through the shadows, through the weight of everything that had held it captive for so long. The darkness tried to pull it back, to drag it into the depths of the underworld. But the horse fought with everything it had, its heart now full of the faintest spark of hope, a hope that it could escape its curse, that it could choose to be something more than a creature of shadows. It didn't know if it would succeed. It didn't know if it could truly escape. But in that moment, as it broke free from the enforcer's grasp, it felt something it had never felt before: the rush of freedom. The storm raged on, the darkness pressing in, but the horse ran faster than it ever had, toward the unknown, toward whatever lay ahead. The tension in the air was unbearable, and yet, for the first time in its existence, the horse felt a glimmer of something that had been absent for so long. A chance, a choice. And the path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it wasn't bound to the past. It was free to decide what came next. The horse's heart pounded as it tore through the storm, the sound of its hooves striking the wet ground like a war drum echoing through the night. The darkness that had always felt like a prison was now a chase, something it could outrun, something it could fight against. Every step brought it closer to the unknown, closer to the faintest promise of freedom. But the weight of the curse, the pull of the underworld, was never far behind. It felt the darkness clawing at its heels, tugging at its very soul, unwilling to let go. The enforcers, the watchers, the very forces of the world that had kept it bound, they were not gone. They were waiting, watching, and now they were closing in faster than ever before. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow. The trees that had once towered above the horse now bent inwards, their twisted limbs closing off the path ahead. The ground beneath it trembled, as though the earth itself was revolting against its flight, as if it had betrayed the very forces that governed it. The air thickened, the wind howling with an unnatural intensity, pushing the horse backward, urging it to return to the path it had always known. And then the ground cracked open. The sound was deafening, a jagged rift splitting the earth, sending a wave of tremors through the air. The horse skidded to a halt, eyes wide, heart racing. From the chasm, an intense, white, hot light began to seep through the cracks, followed by a deafening roar, like the sound of 1,000 souls being torn from their bodies. A deep, guttural laugh, like something ancient and malevolent, rumbled from the depths. The horse froze, feeling an instinctive fear wash over it. It knew that sound, knew that presence, and for the first time, it realized that there were darker forces at play than it had ever imagined. The underworld's reach was not limited to the enforcers and watchers. There were others. Something far older, something even more dangerous, had begun to stir. From the crack in the earth, the figure began to emerge, an entity that was no longer a mere enforcer, but something much more powerful, a being that seemed to bend the very laws of existence to its will. Its form was shifting, a constant swirl of shadow and light, an embodiment of pure chaos. Its eyes glowed with a fiery malice, burning through the storm as if it had always existed, waiting for this very moment. The horse's blood ran cold. This wasn't just another servant of the underworld. This was the source, the very heart of the curse it had been carrying all along. The being from the depths was not a messenger or a watcher. It was the force that had created the horse, the power that had forged it in darkness, binding its soul to the underworld in an unbreakable bond. And now it had come to claim what was its own. "You thought you could run," the voice thundered, its tone deep and chilling, vibrating the very air around the horse. "You cannot escape your nature. You are mine." The horse's body trembled as the words washed over it. It could feel the darkness pulling at its insides, could feel the very weight of its origins trying to drag it back, trying to make it forget everything it had just begun to understand. There was no escaping this. There was no escaping it. This being, this ancient force from the depths, was the one that had given it life, the one that had cursed it in the first place. The horse had been born of shadow and death, forged from a power that was older than time itself. And now, that power was demanding its return. The horse backed away slowly, every instinct screaming to flee, but there was no place to go. The ground around it had already begun to warp and twist, the darkness closing in like an ever-tightening noose. It felt as though the world itself was caving in on it, as though there were no escape, no way to outrun the very force that had given it life. The being from the depths raised its hand, and with a flick of its fingers, the very air seemed to crackle with energy. A force far beyond anything the horse had ever encountered slammed into it, sending it crashing to the ground. The horse's body hit the earth with a sickening thud, and for a moment, everything went black. When it opened its eyes again, it found itself lying in the center of a vast, shifting void, a place between the worlds. The ground beneath it was not solid, but made of swirling, writhing shadows, the sky above a dark, endless expanse of swirling clouds and jagged lightning. This was not the earth. This was not the world the horse had come to know. This was the very heart of the underworld, a place where souls were trapped, where darkness reigned, and where even time seemed to bend and break. "You have been deceived," the being's voice echoed through the void, shaking the horse's very core. "You believed you could change, that you could choose another path. But you are mine. You were made for this." The horse struggled to rise, its body aching, its muscles burning with the strain. It could feel the presence of the underworld all around it, could feel the weight of its curse, the pull of its dark origins. But something within it still burned, a spark that had not been extinguished, a defiance that refused to be silenced. It couldn't give in. Not now. Not after everything it had learned. Not after everything it had felt. "I am not your servant," the horse managed to say, its voice weak but determined. "I will not return to you." The entity laughed, a sound like thunder that rolled through the void. "You cannot deny your true nature," it said, its voice dripping with disdain. "You were born to serve, to collect, to take. You cannot escape it. Not now. Not ever." The horse felt a surge of anger, a surge of something it had never known before. The entity was right about one thing: it had been born from darkness, forged in the fires of the underworld. But it was not a mindless servant. It was not a creature to be controlled. The sparks of compassion, the glimmers of understanding that had begun to grow within it, they were real. They were alive. And they had made the horse something more than the curse that had created it. With a roar, the horse surged to its feet, defying the pull of the underworld that threatened to drag it back into the depths. It wasn't just fighting for itself anymore. It was fighting for everything it had begun to understand, for every soul it had once claimed and now sought to protect. It wasn't just running anymore. It was fighting for its right to choose. The entity's eyes flared with fury as it reached out, summoning the very forces of the void to crush the horse beneath its power. But the horse was no longer the same. With each moment, it grew stronger, its body glowing with a faint, ethereal light, a light that seemed to burn away the darkness that had surrounded it for so long. It had found its purpose. It had found its strength, and it would not be torn away from it. As the ground around them began to crack and shudder, the horse let out a final defiant cry. The battle was not over. The darkness had not won, and for the first time, it felt the weight of the curse lifting, the chains that had bound it beginning to break. The storm raged on, but the horse knew this. Its journey had just begun. The storm raged with a deafening fury, but the horse, now glowing with a light that felt like a new beginning, stood firm in the heart of the void. The shadows around it twisted and screamed in agony as the light from within it spread, cutting through the darkness like a blade. It wasn't just a light, it was hope, a powerful force that defied the very nature of the underworld. The air crackled with energy, the tension building to a crescendo as the horse prepared to face the ancient force that had created it. The entity, its form swirling with rage, extended its hand, and the very fabric of the void trembled. The horse felt the weight of its power bearing down on it, the world around it threatening to collapse under the sheer force of the curse. But there was no fear anymore. The horse had come too far to give in. With a sharp, guttural cry, it charged forward, its hooves striking the shadowed ground with unrelenting force. The figure stepped closer, lowering their voice to a near, inaudible level. Because you're not the first, and you won't be the last. The rebellion, the fight against the system, it was all orchestrated from the very beginning. The ones who control the city, the ones who created you, they always knew you would rise up. They wanted you to. They knew it would give them the power to solidify their control once and for all. The rebel horse felt as though the ground beneath it had shifted, the very foundation of everything it knew cracking wide open. It took a step back, the shock making its legs weak beneath it. "No, that can't be true," it muttered, shaking its head. "We fought to escape. We fought for freedom." The figure's gaze softened, just for a moment, as though they were pitying the rebel horse. "That's what you were meant to think. That's what they wanted you to believe. But why?" Its companion demanded, stepping forward, their voice filled with disbelief and anger. "Why would they want us to rise up? Why would they want to give us the power to overthrow them?" The figure's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing their face. "Because the power of the rebellion is an illusion. You are always meant to be the tool that would pave the way for their true plan. The horses, the modified ones like you, were never meant to lead a revolution. You were meant to be part of a bigger system, to bring about a new world order, one that would control everyone, not just the horses." A silence fell over the group. The rebel horse's mind reeled as it processed the revelation. Everything it had thought it understood the rebellion, the fight for freedom, the plan to escape, was a manipulation. The entire struggle had been engineered, designed from the very start to serve a hidden purpose. But what was that purpose? And why had it never seen the truth? The figure stepped back, looking over their shoulder at the advancing noise of the approaching drones. "You don't have much time. If you want to get out, you need to decide now. But the real question is, do you even want to escape anymore?" The rebel horse's chest tightened. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about running from the authorities. It was about understanding the true nature of its existence, the true reason for the rebellion. The more it thought about the figure's words, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place, each one more unsettling than the last. But before it could process any further, a new sound filled the air, the unmistakable hum of drones overhead, the flash of lights cutting through the darkness. The authorities had arrived, and they were closing in fast. The rebel horse's thoughts were a blur, caught between the need to survive and the crushing weight of what it had just learned. Could it really trust anyone anymore? Could it trust even itself? The figure turned sharply, their face hardening. "This isn't over. But the truth will come for you. It will find you, whether you're ready or not." With that, the figure melted into the shadows, leaving the rebel horse and its companion alone with their thoughts and the sound of the drones growing louder, closer. The tunnel suddenly felt smaller, as though it were closing in on them, the walls pressing in from all sides. The rebel horse felt a rising panic, the weight of its decision pressing down like a vice. It had come so far, fought so hard, but now everything was uncertain. Everything was in question. The drone's searchlights swept over the tunnel entrance, and the rebel horse knew there was no time left. There was no turning back now. They had to move. But as it dashed toward the tunnel's exit, something gnawed at it, a nagging feeling deep in its gut. The truth was out there. And the rebellion? The rebel horse's heart raced as it bolted through the darkened tunnel, its hooves pounding against the cold, hard ground. Its companion was close behind, but the sense of urgency, the pressure of the oncoming drones, pressed them forward at a pace that felt like it would tear them apart. The figure's words still echoed in the rebel horse's mind, each sentence heavier than the last. The truth, the manipulation, the plan. It was all too much to take in, too much to process in the heat of the moment. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving, had to find a way out. The exit of the tunnel loomed ahead, a sliver of light breaking through the darkness. They were close, but as they neared the end, the sounds of the drones grew deafening, the bright searchlights cutting through the shadows like daggers. The rebel horse pushed itself harder, faster, its lungs burning with each breath. But just as they reached the tunnel's mouth, a sharp pain shot through its side. The clash was like the collision of two worlds. The entity's dark energy met the horse's light in an explosion of raw power. The void shook, and for a moment everything was silent, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then, with an ear-splitting roar, the darkness exploded outward, shattering the very fabric of the underworld. The entity screeched, its form flickering and twisting as the light from the horse continued to tear through it, unraveling the curse that had bound it to the underworld. For a brief moment, the entity seemed to falter, its power waning, and the horse surged forward with everything it had left. The battle had reached its peak, the tension too thick to bear, and as the horse's hooves struck the ground one final time, a shockwave of pure energy ripped through the void. The darkness cracked and shattered, and the entity screamed in agony as its form collapsed into nothingness, disintegrating like ash in the wind. The storm began to calm, the heavy air lifting, and the world around the horse started to shift. The curse that had plagued it for so long was finally breaking apart, unraveling with the destruction of the entity that had birthed it. For the first time in its existence, the horse felt free, a sense of peace washing over it as the weight of the darkness lifted from its soul. But just as the horse stood there, panting and exhausted, something strange began to happen. The ground beneath it trembled once more, but this time, it wasn't the underworld's power that surged. It was something else, something familiar. The air grew thick with an unsettling tension, and the horse turned, its eyes widening in disbelief. From the broken remains of the void, another figure emerged, a figure cloaked in shadows, its form shifting and intangible. This one, however, was different. It was not like the enforcers or the entity it had just defeated. It was older, more ancient, and more terrifying. Its presence seemed to ripple through time itself, bending the very fabric of reality. The horse took a cautious step back, its heart racing again, uncertainty creeping in once more. "You thought you were free," the figure spoke, its voice a soft, haunting whisper that seemed to echo in every corner of the void. "But you were never meant to escape. You were merely a pawn, a tool for something far greater." The horse's blood ran cold. This wasn't the end. This wasn't freedom. This was the true force that had been behind the curse all along, the entity that had watched over the underworld for eons, the power that had kept it bound to its purpose. The horse had not broken free. It had merely been a step in a much larger game. The figure's eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and as it moved closer, the horse could feel the darkness pressing in again, this time with an even more suffocating force. The very air seemed to freeze as the figure's power washed over the horse, drawing it back into the depths of the void. The horse wanted to resist, to fight, but it felt the cold, heavy weight of fate closing in around it once again. "You are nothing but a shadow," the figure whispered. "And shadows can never escape the darkness." But just as the figure reached out, preparing to pull the horse back into the eternal depths of the underworld, a new force erupted from within the horse. A spark of light, a sudden rush of power surged from deep inside, more intense than anything it had ever felt before. The horse's body flared with energy, and with a cry that shattered the air, it broke free from the figure's grasp, the light surrounding it blinding in its intensity. The void seemed to split apart, the shadows retreating before the sheer force of the light emanating from the horse. For a moment, the figure staggered back, its form flickering and fading, unable to withstand the power that the horse had unlocked. The darkness that had once defined it began to unravel, the chains that had bound it for so long dissolving in the face of this newfound strength. The horse, its body glowing brighter than ever before, pushed forward, determined to break free. This was the moment, the final battle between light and darkness, between fate and choice. Figure, now barely holding on to its form, screeched in rage, but it was too late. The light exploded outward, engulfing everything, and with a final cry, the figure was consumed, its essence dissolved into nothingness. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The storm had passed, the darkness had receded, and the horse stood alone in the center of a vast, empty space. The weight of the curse was gone, the chains of its past broken. It was no longer a creature of death, no longer bound to the underworld. It was free. But as the horse stood there, its breath steady and its body still, something lingered in the air, a faint echo of something familiar, something almost comforting. The presence of the child, the compassion it had once felt, still hung in the space around it. The horse looked around, its heart swelling with an unexpected warmth. It had broken free of the darkness, yes, but it had also learned something far more important along the way. Compassion, love, the ability to choose. It had become something more than it had ever been, something beyond its curse, something that no force in the universe could take away. The underworld had tried to shape it, to control it, but it had never been able to erase the light within. And so, as the horse stepped forward, it didn't feel the pull of the underworld anymore. It felt the pull of something new, a new path, a new purpose. But as it moved toward the horizon, a shadow lingered behind it. Not all battles were over. The true test was yet to come. The twist was unexpected. The horse had escaped the grasp of the underworld, but in doing so, it had opened the door to an even greater challenge. The forces of light and darkness were far from finished with it, and now the journey to discover its true place in the world had only just begun. The stakes had risen. The future was uncertain, and the horse knew that its fight for freedom was far from over. As it moved forward into the unknown, the question hung heavy in the air. Could it remain free, or would it once again be drawn back into the shadows? The answer lay ahead, in a world that was waiting to see what the horse had become. The horse continued to move forward, its hooves striking the ground with steady purpose. The world around it was still and quiet now, the darkness lifting as though the very atmosphere was finally exhaling after a long, suffocating breath. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm, empty expanse. The horse felt the weight of its journey, the battle, the struggle, the victory beginning to settle within it. But it was not the end. There was something more. There was still a question lingering in the air. What was it now? As the horse moved further into the distance, its mind lingered on the echoes of the past. It had been created for one purpose, an instrument of darkness, a being to serve, to collect, to feed the underworld. But that was no longer its truth. It had fought against its origins, shattered the chains that had bound it to the underworld, and found something greater within itself: compassion, a sense of self, a will to choose. It had learned to value life in a way it had never known before. But in this new, quiet world, there was still much it did not understand. The landscape ahead seemed endless. The horizon stretched out before it, like an invitation, a promise of something yet to be discovered. But the horse could not move forward without understanding what it had become. It had defeated the darkness, but it was now standing at the edge of an entirely new world, a world that held as much uncertainty as the one it had left behind. The journey had been long, and yet it was only beginning. As the horse walked, a presence began to form at the edges of its consciousness, something familiar, something it had felt before but never fully understood. It was a feeling of warmth, of recognition, and slowly it began to take shape in the air before it a figure, standing at the edge of the horizon. It was the child. The figure stood motionless, the soft glow of the light surrounding it, a stark contrast to the dark emptiness that had once consumed the world. The horse stopped, its heart pounding as it recognized the familiar presence. The child had always been there, lingering in the background, a faint glimmer of compassion amidst the shadows. But now, the child was standing before it, as real as anything in this new world. The horse approached slowly, cautiously, unsure of what this meeting meant. "Why are you here?" the horse asked, its voice hoarse, still shaking from the battle. The child smiled softly, the glow of its presence brighter than before. "I am here to remind you," the child said, its voice gentle, as if it was speaking to the horse as an equal. "You have already answered the question. The journey you've taken has shown you that you are not just a creature of darkness. You are a being capable of choice, of compassion. You've learned the most important lesson of all. You have the power to change your path." The words sank deep into the horse's heart, resonating with everything it had fought for. It had always been driven by an urge to collect, to take. But now, it understood that true strength did not come from domination. True strength came from the ability to protect, to cherish, and to choose a path that led to peace rather than destruction. "But what now?" the horse asked, uncertainty creeping into its voice. "Where do I go from here? What is my purpose?" The child stepped forward, its form radiating warmth and kindness. "Your purpose is not to serve the underworld or any greater power. Your purpose is to find balance, to guide those who are lost and help them find their own path. You have the power to choose who you want to be, just as others have the power to choose their own way." The horse stood in silence, absorbing the child's words. It had always believed that its purpose was predetermined, that it was bound to a certain fate. But now, it saw that its future was not written in the stars. It was something it could shape. It had the power to break free of its past, to carve a new path in a world that was waiting for it. "I am not just a shadow," the horse whispered, as if the realization was dawning on it for the first time. "I am something more." The child nodded, its smile broadening. "Exactly. You are more than what you were made to be. You are a being of choice, of growth. The darkness will always try to pull you back, but now you know that you don't have to go willingly." The horse looked around, the horizon stretching endlessly before it, full of possibilities. It felt a new sense of freedom rising within it, a sense of purpose it had never known. The world was vast, and it was no longer just a prisoner of its curse. It had a chance to become something greater. But just as it began to turn away, ready to move forward, the child spoke again. "You may never fully escape the darkness. It will always linger in the corners of your mind, just as it lingers in the world. But you don't have to be ruled by it. You can shape your own future. You can be a light in the darkness. The horse stood still for a moment, taking in the child's words. The darkness would always be a part of it. It was a part of its origin, a part of its being. But it was no longer the only thing that defined it. There was light within it now, and that light would guide its way forward. The child began to fade, its figure dissolving into the air, leaving behind only the soft glow of its presence. "Remember, your journey is not over," the child said. "It's only just begun." The horse watched as the figure disappeared, and for a moment it stood there in silence, the weight of everything that had come before settling within it. The battle with the underworld was over, but the real challenge was just beginning. It had broken free from its chains, but it now had to figure out who it truly was. It had the power to choose, and it would no longer be ruled by its past. With a final, determined glance at the horizon, the horse began to walk forward once more, the world stretching out before it, like an open book waiting to be written. There was so much it didn't know, so much it hadn't yet discovered. But it was ready. It was free. The darkness would always be there, but now the horse could face it without fear. It would choose its path. It would choose its future. And no matter what came next, it would be prepared. As the horse disappeared into the distance, the world behind it faded into a soft twilight, the echoes of the past growing fainter with each step. The future lay ahead, full of challenges, but also full of hope. The journey was far from over. The light inside the horse burned brighter than ever, and with each passing day, it would grow stronger. There was no more darkness in the horse's heart. There was only the endless possibility of what could come next. And that was enough. The horse had found its way home,